The air in Maple Creek's livestock auction hall was thick with dust and the quiet hum of murmurs. Emma Turner stood in the back corner, her worn boots scraping the rough wooden floor as she shifted her weight. The flickering lights above cast shadows over the rows of cattle pens and stalls, the sounds of hooves clopping against the cement mixing with the occasional snort of a nervous animal. She was out of place here, she knew it. The wealthy ranchers and breeders surrounding her wore crisp denim and polished boots, a stark contrast to her faded jacket and the threadbare jeans she had been wearing for years. Her eyes, however, weren't on the crowd or the gleaming horses being paraded before potential buyers. They were focused on the pitiful creature lying in the dirt just beyond the auctioneer's platform. The horse was barely recognizable. He had been a beauty once, a bay with a coat that glistened like polished wood, but now his ribs jutted out from beneath his fur, which was matted and dull. His legs, thin and trembling, barely held his weight as he lay motionless. The only striking thing about him was the crescent-shaped marking on his forehead, a white patch, almost like a symbol. But there was no sign of life in his eyes, just an emptiness that seemed to pull Emma closer, as though his suffering mirrored something inside her. The auctioneer's voice broke through the heavy silence. "Going once, going twice, for $1. $1, folks, not negotiable, not a mercy bid. Just one cold final dollar. Who'll take him?" Emma's heart clenched as she heard the low murmur ripple through the crowd. No one was interested. No one wanted a horse that looked like he was already dead. There was no one to bid for him, no one who could see what she saw. Her father's words echoed in her mind. A horse is more than a tool, more than a beast of burden. They're souls, just like us, Emma. Don't ever forget that. Her father had raised her around horses. She remembered when she was little, the smell of hay, the sound of hooves hitting the earth as they galloped together across the open fields. It was here, at this very auction, that she had ridden him, the horse that had become more than a ride to her. His name was Echo. But that was a lifetime ago. When Emma's father had passed, he had left her nothing but memories and an old barn on the edge of town. The farm had collapsed under debts, and the horses, one by one, were sold off. Echo, however, had always been special. He wasn't just a horse bred for speed or agility. He was different, and he had meant something to her father, something beyond winning ribbons or breeding awards. The auctioneer's voice broke through her thoughts. "Any bids for the horse? $1, folks. It's his last chance." A wave of silence passed over the room, heavy with unspoken judgment. And then, as though the air itself held its breath, Emma stepped forward. She didn't think about the money. She didn't think about the ridicule. She didn't think about the truck that barely ran, or the broken-down barn, or the mountain of bills waiting for her at home. She just thought of him. "I'll take him," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The words cut through the silence like a crack of thunder. The auctioneer blinked, confused. "Ma'am?" He looked up, eyebrows raised. Did you say you'll take him?" "I'll take him," Emma repeated, pulling a crumpled dollar bill from her jacket and laying it on the table beside the sign. "He's not done. He's not finished yet." For a moment, the entire room stood still. No one moved. The auctioneer stared at her for a beat longer than necessary, then slowly nodded, as if accepting the truth that wasn't written on any bid sheet. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some of the men behind the railing shot disapproving glances, but there was no laughter. No one mocked her. The silence felt heavy, like the room itself was holding its breath. Emma stepped forward, her heart pounding as she walked up to Echo. He barely lifted his head when she reached him, his eyes dull and lifeless. She knelt beside him, pressing her forehead gently to his. She whispered something soft, something only the two of them would understand. The horse, once a symbol of strength and vitality, lay in the dust now like a ghost of what he had been. But as Emma's hand moved over his trembling body, something flickered behind his glassy eyes, a faint spark of recognition, something deeper than a heartbeat, a flicker of life, just enough to remind her that he wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. "Come on, old boy," she whispered, brushing the dust from his coat. "We've still got work to do." She could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on her as she gently helped Echo to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him. There was no applause. There was no cheer. There was only the quiet murmur of a crowd that didn't understand, a crowd that had already given up on him. Emma didn't need anyone else to understand. She didn't need their approval. She only needed him. Slowly, she led him away from the platform, every step a battle. His legs buckled, but she was there, guiding him, whispering words of reassurance, just like when she was a little girl, just like when they were free together. Step by step, Emma walked, and Echo followed her, though he barely seemed to have the strength to move. But he moved, and that was enough. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, a slow drizzle that soaked through Emma's jacket as she helped Echo to the rickety old truck. The auction had ended, the crowd had scattered, but for Emma it had only just begun. She wasn't done yet, and neither was Echo. The sound of Echo's hooves against the worn gravel road echoed through the empty fields as Emma drove her rusty Ford truck toward her father's old barn. It was all she had left now. The barn, the memories, and the vague hope that she could somehow bring Echo back from the brink. The truck sputtered and coughed with each turn of the key, but somehow it still moved, and that was enough for Emma. The heavy rain that had started just after the auction now poured in sheets, and the windshield wipers struggled to keep up. She glanced over at Echo, who lay weakly in the bed of the truck, his body still trembling from exhaustion. Emma's heart ached as she watched the horse shift uncomfortably, his ribs showing clearly beneath his matted fur. She had seen him like this once before, when he was a colt, hungry, and struggling to keep up with the rest of the herd. Her father had always been there to guide them, to give them what they needed. But now, there was no one left, just her, and a horse on the brink of death. She couldn't help but wonder if she was making a mistake. She wasn't a vet, she wasn't a trained trainer, she barely had enough money to buy hay, let alone the medicines and supplies she would need to nurse Echo back to health. Yet, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving him there, to be discarded by the world like an old, forgotten relic. He wasn't just any horse, he was hers, and she had no intention of letting him go without a fight. As the barn came into view, Emma's resolve only hardened. The rain continued to pour, but there was something about the sight of the barn, old, weathered, and worn, that gave her a strange sense of comfort. It was where she had spent countless hours with her father, where she had first learned to ride. It was the only place that had ever felt like home. Pulling up to the barn, Emma didn't bother with the usual precautions. The truck's brakes screeched in protest as she stopped, and she quickly jumped out, the mud and rain soaking her boots. She rushed to the bed of the truck and gently coaxed Echo out. The horse seemed to have little strength, but he stood with her help, swaying on his legs as she led him into the barn. The smell of old hay and wood greeted her as she opened the barn door. It was familiar, comforting. But the barn was empty now. No horses, no farmhands. Just the echo of a life that had once been full of promise and ambition, now reduced to memories and a pile of debts. The barn had fallen into disrepair after her father's passing, but Emma couldn't bring herself to sell it, to let go of the last piece of him. Now it was her sanctuary, and for Echo, it would be a refuge. She led him to the farthest stall, the one that used to be her father's. The wood was worn, the walls cracked, but it would do. Emma gently lowered a mattress she had borrowed from a neighbor onto the cold concrete floor and covered it with some old hay. She knew it wasn't much, but it was the best she could do. She wanted him to feel comfortable, to feel like he was safe. As she helped Echo lie down, she couldn't help but feel a deep sadness. He was so weak, so fragile. She stroked his mane gently, her fingers trembling. "I'm not going to give up on you, Echo," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're not alone." The horse barely responded, his breathing shallow. Emma sat beside him, her back against the wooden stall, and let out a long, exhausted sigh. She knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but she couldn't just walk away, not when he was still fighting. For hours, Emma stayed by his side, talking to him softly, telling him stories of the past. She spoke of her father, of the good times they had shared. She told him of the times they had run across the fields, the sun on their faces, the wind in their hair. She told him of the dreams her father had for him, of the greatness he had once seen in the horse. As the night dragged on, Emma grew tired. She hadn't slept much since her father's death, and the weight of the day, of the auction, of the struggles ahead, was starting to take its toll. She felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, the steady rhythm of Echo's breathing a lullaby that was oddly comforting. She leaned her head against the wall of the stall, her eyes closing as she fought to stay awake. Then a small sound broke through the silence. Emma's eyes snapped open, and she looked down at Echo. The horse's ears twitched, and for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But then she saw it again. His back leg kicked slightly, a feeble movement, but a movement nonetheless. Her heart leapt in her chest. "Echo?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Can you hear me?" The horse didn't answer, of course, but Emma could feel something change in the air. There was still life in him, there was still hope. She moved closer to him, her hand resting on his neck, her fingers brushing his fur. She whispered to him again, her voice low and soothing. She didn't know if he could understand her, but it didn't matter. All she knew was that she couldn't let him go. Not like this. For the rest of the night, Emma stayed beside him, talking to him, keeping him company. She wasn't sure when she fell asleep, but the sound of her own steady breathing, mixed with the soft rustling of the hay, seemed to fill the barn with a sense of calm. The next morning, as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the barn walls, Emma woke to find Echo's head lifted slightly. His eyes were still dull, but there was something different in them now. A flicker of recognition, a glimmer of life. It was enough. For the first time since she'd brought him home, Emma felt a sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, or how long it would take for Echo to recover, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to give up on him. Not now. Not ever. The barn was quiet in the early hours of the morning. The storm that had raged through the night had passed, leaving only the faint sound of rain drumming on the barn's roof. Emma had managed to get a few hours of sleep, but it wasn't enough. She had barely closed her eyes before waking up to check on Echo, who was still lying quietly in the hay. The horse had improved since the night before. His breathing was steadier, his eyes clearer. Emma could see the faintest hint of life returning to him. And though the progress was slow, it was progress nonetheless. She knew it would take time. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but there was something in her heart, a flicker of hope that had been absent for so long, that told her Echo wasn't done yet. Emma moved to fetch some water for him, but just as she stepped outside the barn, she heard the unmistakable sound of tires crunching on gravel. She froze, her heart racing. She hadn't expected any visitors, not in this storm-drenched weather. The only people who knew where she was were Marvin, the neighbor who had helped her with hay, and Jesse Callahan, her father's old business partner, whom she hadn't seen in years. When the truck pulled to a stop in front of the barn, Emma's stomach twisted. She didn't need to see the driver to know it was Jesse. There was something about the way the truck had rolled up, the slow, deliberate pace. It was the same way Jesse always drove when he was about to make an entrance. She hesitated for a moment, her hand gripping the wooden doorframe. Should she go out? Should she face him now, after everything that had happened? The man who had been a part of her father's life, who had disappeared without a trace after the ranch went bankrupt. Before she could decide, the door creaked open, and Jesse Callahan stepped into the barn, his hat pulled low over his eyes, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. The rainwater still dripped from his coat, and his boots left muddy tracks on the barn floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with years of unspoken words, of regrets neither of them knew how to address. Jesse's eyes flickered to Echo, lying quietly in the hay, his body still weak but showing signs of life. There was a strange look in his eyes, something like disbelief, mixed with a deep sadness that Emma couldn't quite place. "I heard about him," Jesse finally said, his voice rough. "Figured I'd come check on you and him." Emma stood tall, her back straight. She wasn't sure what to say. She didn't want to hear the words she knew were coming. But she couldn't back down now, not after everything she had been through, not after the fight she had already put up. "You should have stayed away, Jesse," she said, her voice steady. "You don't have the right to come here now." Jesse flinched, as if her words were a slap. He took a step forward, his face softening slightly. "I didn't think he'd make it through the night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think any of us would." Emma's heart sank. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her words trembling despite herself. "Why did you leave him, leave us like that, after everything?" Jesse sighed, running a hand through his wet hair. "It wasn't like that, Emma," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "We didn't know what we were doing, okay? Your father, he was brilliant, but he wasn't careful. We tried to build something bigger than we could handle. We gambled, and we lost." Emma's eyes narrowed, the bitterness from the past rising up again. "That's no excuse. My father trusted you. He trusted all of you." She turned away from him, walking over to Echo's side. The horse's eyes followed her, his breathing shallow but steady. Jesse took a few hesitant steps toward her, then stopped. "He was trying to do something different, something no one else dared to," he said quietly. "He didn't just breed horses for the market, Emma. He wanted to prove something. Echo wasn't just any horse. Your father bred him to be different." Emma looked up, confusion flickering in her eyes. "What do you mean?" Jesse took a deep breath. "Your father wanted to make a statement, Emma. He didn't want Echo to be just another racehorse. He wanted him to be something more, a symbol, a rebellion against the system. Echo wasn't bred to be fast or strong in the conventional sense. He was meant to prove that a horse's worth wasn't in its pedigree, but in its heart." Emma shook her head, trying to make sense of his words. "That's why you all abandoned him?" she asked, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Because he wasn't fast enough for the registry. Because he didn't fit their idea of what a horse should be." Jesse nodded slowly. "We couldn't register him. We couldn't sell him the way we wanted to. The breeders, the racing community, they wouldn't accept him. They wouldn't accept the idea that a horse like Echo could be worth anything. So your father, he kept him a secret." And when the ranch went under, we thought we could get him out of there, put him in a better place, but by the time I got to him, it was too late." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Echo, her Echo, had been a symbol of her father's rebellion, a horse that had never belonged to the world that had tried to define him. And in the end, he had been discarded like trash, left to rot in a forgotten corner of the world. She turned back to Echo, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch his mane. "You didn't think he would survive, but he's still here," she whispered. "He's still fighting." Jesse stood in silence for a moment, watching her. "I didn't think he'd make it," he admitted, his voice soft, "but maybe I was wrong." Emma's thoughts raced. Echo wasn't just a horse. He was a piece of her father's legacy, a piece of everything that had gone wrong. But now, she realized, he wasn't just her father's. He was hers. And she wasn't going to let anyone take him away from her. "Why are you here, Jesse?" Emma finally asked, her voice hard. "What do you want?" Jesse hesitated before answering. "I came because I heard what you were doing with him. You're giving him a chance, Emma. I didn't think anyone would. But you are. And maybe I owe you an apology for everything." Emma stared at him for a long time, her mind spinning with everything she had just learned. But one thing was clear: Echo was hers now. And no matter what Jesse said, no matter what the world thought of him, she was going to fight for him. She wasn't going to let his past define him. "Apology accepted," she said softly, turning back to Echo. "But I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for him and for my father." The weight of the moment hung in the air between them. Jesse nodded slowly, as if understanding for the first time what Emma had been through. "I won't get in your way, Emma," he said quietly. "But if you need help, you know where to find me." As he turned and walked out of the barn, Emma stayed with Echo, her hand gently stroking his mane. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: she wasn't alone anymore. Echo was still fighting, and so was she. The days that followed Jesse's visit were quiet, but the weight of the decision Emma had made was heavy on her shoulders. Echo had shown small signs of recovery. His breathing was more even, and his legs had steadied enough to support his weight for longer stretches. But there was still a long road ahead, and Emma wasn't sure if she was strong enough to see it through. It was late one afternoon when the letter came. She had just finished feeding Echo, the smell of oats and hay filling the barn as she prepared to settle in for the night. The rain had come back again, this time lighter but steady, tapping on the barn roof like an unwelcome reminder of everything she couldn't control. The letter was thick, its edges sharp and formal. As she ripped it open, her stomach tightened with a familiar sense of dread. The letter was from the American Thoroughbred Registry. She had known this day was coming, but reading the words on the page felt like a slap in the face. Unauthorized possession of an unregistered stallion with contested lineage. The words were a cold reminder of what she was up against. A system that didn't care about Echo's worth or her fight. It only cared about the papers, the pedigree, the bloodlines that marked whether an animal belonged in the world or not. Emma's hands trembled as she read on, her eyes skipping over the bureaucratic language until the words "mandatory review pending" jumped out at her. The last line read, "Failure to comply may result in seizure." She crumpled the paper in her hand, her chest tight with frustration. For a brief moment, she considered throwing the letter in the fire, letting it burn along with all the doubts and insecurities she had been carrying. But the thought of losing Echo, the one thing that had kept her going since her father's death, was unbearable. She couldn't just let them take him. She wouldn't. "I'm not giving up on you," she whispered to Echo, who was lying quietly in the stall, his body still fragile but slowly regaining strength. "We're not going anywhere." The next day, Emma stood outside her father's old barn, her eyes scanning the horizon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the fields. She had made up her mind. She was going to take Echo to the Autumn Ridge Horse Exhibition, the same event her father had dreamed of entering him in. It wasn't a race or a competition. It was a showcase of horsemanship, a place for breeders, trainers, and enthusiasts to demonstrate their skills. Her father had always talked about how Echo could shine there, not because of his bloodline or pedigree, but because of the bond between them. Emma didn't expect to win. She didn't even expect the judges to give her a second glance, but she had to show the world that Echo was worth something more than his registration papers. She had to show them that he was more than just a horse. He was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system that had tried to bury him. Her heart raced as she prepared Echo for the exhibition. She didn't have much to work with, a few old saddles, a borrowed trailer from Marvin, but she didn't care. She was used to doing things with little to no help. This was her fight, and she was going to see it through. When the day of the exhibition arrived, the sky was clear, the air crisp and cool. The grounds were bustling with activity, the sounds of hooves and chatter filling the air as Emma led Echo into the arena. She could feel the eyes on her as they passed the rows of polished trailers and prize-winning horses. The crowd murmured, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. They were used to seeing horses with perfect coats, flawless pedigrees, and spotless records. And then there was Echo, unregistered, unpolished, with a patchy coat and a history that didn't fit into their narrow world of expectations. But Emma held her head high as she walked into the ring. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need them to see what she saw in Echo. She just needed to prove to herself that they could still do this, that they could still be something together. As they entered the ring, Emma felt a sense of calm wash over her. Echo walked beside her, his head held low but steady. His gait was uneven, his body still frail, but there was something in his eyes that had changed since the night she brought him home. He wasn't the broken, forgotten horse from the auction anymore. He was standing beside her, moving with a quiet determination that mirrored her own. The crowd grew quiet as Emma and Echo made their way to the center of the ring. She could feel the weight of their gazes, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't about them. It was about proving that Echo had a place in the world, even if that place was outside the world that had discarded him. Emma mounted Echo slowly, careful not to overwhelm him. He shifted beneath her, his muscles trembling, but he didn't buck. He stood tall, steady. She took a deep breath, her hands on the reins, her body in sync with his. Above, they began to move, slowly at first, but with increasing confidence. They were a team, connected not by bloodlines but by the bond they shared. The crowd was silent as they moved through the routine. No fancy tricks, no jumps, no high-speed sprints. Just a simple, graceful demonstration of trust, balance, and unity. Emma guided Echo through each movement, her body flowing with his, her hands gentle but firm. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't trying to win. She was simply showing the world what was possible when you didn't let the world define you. When they finished, Emma sat still, her hands resting on the reins as Echo stood in the center of the ring, breathing heavily but standing tall. The silence in the arena was deafening. Some of the judges exchanged glances, their faces unreadable. Emma held her breath, waiting for the inevitable judgment. She had expected the whispers, the disapproval. But what happened next wasn't what she had prepared for. From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "That horse is unregistered. He's a fraud." The man was standing, his face red with indignation. "This is a disgrace." Emma's heart raced, but she didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She stood tall in the center of the ring, facing the crowd. She had expected this moment, but what came next was unexpected. "Let me explain something," she said, her voice clear and strong. "This horse was bred by a man who believed worth isn't determined by papers. He was discarded, sold for $1, forgotten, but he lived. He stood here today on his own legs. And if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe you should ask yourselves why." The crowd was still. No one clapped, no one cheered. But Emma felt something shift in the air. The murmurs died down, and one of the judges, an older man with graying hair and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, stood slowly. "What's his name?" the judge asked, his voice carrying across the ring. Emma's throat tightened as she answered, "His name is Echo." The judge nodded, then wiped his glasses with a handkerchief, his eyes never leaving her. "That horse shouldn't be here, but I've been watching exhibitions for 40 years, and I've never seen a bond like that." The crowd was silent for a moment longer. Then, one by one, the applause began. It was hesitant at first, a slow clap from the back of the crowd, but soon it grew. The sound of it filled the arena, swelling until it felt like the very walls of the place were shaking. Emma didn't smile. She didn't bow. She didn't need to. Echo had already won. The sun had begun to dip beneath the horizon by the time Emma and Echo left the exhibition grounds. The noise of the crowd still echoed in her ears, the faint murmurs and the slow clapping that had built into something real, something sincere. But now, the world felt quieter, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma could breathe. She wasn't sure what had changed, but something had shifted in the air that day. The silence after her speech, the eyes that had watched her, some skeptical, some moved, had felt like the weight of 1,000 unspoken judgments lifting. She had proven that Echo was worth more than his papers, more than his past. He was worth something that couldn't be measured, not by anyone's standards but her own. The ride back to the barn was long, the truck rattling and creaking as it made its way down the dirt road. Echo, despite his weariness, stood tall in the bed of the truck, his head low but steady. Emma kept glancing over her shoulder at him, her heart still racing from the exhibition. She couldn't believe how far they had come. From that first moment at the auction, when she had bought him for $1, to standing before a crowd that had once dismissed him. It wasn't just Echo who had changed, it was Emma, too. In that ring, under the watchful eyes of the judges, the breeders, and the crowd, she had stood tall, not as the girl trying to live up to her father's legacy, but as a woman who had found her own strength. She had fought for Echo, and in doing so, she had fought for herself. When they arrived at the barn, Emma helped Echo out of the truck, her hands gentle on his side as he stumbled slightly before finding his balance. She led him to the stall, where the dim light of the lantern cast a soft glow over his form. She wasn't sure if he was fully aware of what had happened, but she could see it in his eyes. There was something different there now, a flicker of life that hadn't been there before. As she settled him into the stall, she noticed something on the floor, an envelope, worn and frayed at the edges. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the handwriting on the front. For Emma. It was a letter from her father. She had seen that handwriting before, on countless old bills and contracts, on notes he had left for her when he was too busy to talk. But this letter, this one was different. It was the one thing she had never expected to find. She sat on the hay bale beside Echo, her hands trembling as she opened it. The faint scent of old paper and ink filled her nose as she read the words her father had written. his handwriting clear but shaky, as though he had written it in a rush. "If you ever bring Echo home, it means you're stronger than I ever was. Don't let them break you. Don't let them tell you who deserves to be remembered." Tears welled up in Emma's eyes as she read the short note. Her father had known, even in the end, that Echo wasn't just any horse. He was a piece of their past, a piece of the fight they had never finished. Her father had always believed in Echo, had always seen something in him that no one else had. And now, it was her turn to carry that belief forward. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to steady her breath. This letter, this final gift from her father, was more than just words. It was a message, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. There was still something left to prove. Echo wasn't just a horse that had been abandoned and forgotten, he was a symbol. He had survived everything, just like she had, and together they would keep going. As Emma stood there, the letter still clutched in her hands, the sound of footsteps reached her ears. Marvin's truck was pulling into the driveway, the headlights cutting through the darkness. She smiled to herself, wiping away the last of her tears as she tucked the letter into her jacket pocket. It wasn't over. Not yet. Marvin's voice called out as he approached, his boots crunching in the gravel. Well, that was something, wasn't it? Emma laughed softly, her voice thick with emotion. Yeah, it was. I think we've all got a lot to think about. Marvin stopped at the door, looking past her into the barn. You did good today, Emma, real good. That was something I'll never forget. She nodded, her gaze turning back to Echo, who was quietly munching on the hay in his stall. He was still fragile, still healing, but there was a quiet strength about him now. A strength that had been there all along, hidden beneath the scars of neglect and abandonment. I didn't do it for them, Emma said, her voice steady now. I did it for him and for my father. Marvin nodded, understanding the weight of her words. You did it for both of them. And for yourself. That's what matters. Emma's gaze lingered on Echo, her heart swelling with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, and she knew that the fight wasn't over. There would be more obstacles, more battles to face. But for the first time in a long time, she felt ready for whatever came next. Do you think he's really ready? Marvin asked, his voice soft as he looked at the horse. Emma smiled and stepped toward Echo's stall, her hand resting gently on his neck. I don't know, she said quietly, but he's still here, and so am I. She reached down and patted Echo gently, feeling the warmth of his coat beneath her fingers. His eyes met hers, steady and calm, as if to say that he had never truly been lost. They had always been a team, and now they were stronger than ever. That night, as the barn settled into the quiet stillness of the late hours, Emma sat beside Echo, the soft rustle of hay and the steady rhythm of his breathing filling the air. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had finally found her place. Echo wasn't just a horse. He was a part of her past, a part of her father's dreams, and now he was part of her future. Together they had faced the darkness, and together they would rise. She wasn't alone anymore, and neither was he.